I would like to introduce you to a gentleman from a certain village in the south who is prepared to address you on what at this time constitutes the bane of your societal existence. Besides others, he has a master's degree in applied criminology from the University of Ottawa in Canada. His topic is crime, a certain perception. The topic of crime is vast, and though by his own admission he has not covered many aspects of it, for example, police and policing, the fire service, penal rehabilitation and punishment, they are areas deserving of formal erudite pronouncement. Much can be said, and of which he is abundantly aware, and so he seeks your forgiveness for the sin of prolixity. This gentleman hails from Labrie, and his appellation is Dr. Velon John. I now present to you this gentleman for your education and edification.
Good day, fellow St. Lucians. This presentation, which in some measure is a compilation of my thoughts over a period of time, reflects my thinking on the generic issue of the breakdown of law and order, its linkages with relevant societal components, and its attendant consequence of the tsunami of crime that has engulfed and alarmed our society by its ubiquity, heinousness, constancy, and plurality. And so at this time, and contextually speaking, this our country as I see it is in a state of crisis. And in consequence thereof, there is the urgent and desperate need for innovative, creative, pragmatic thinking and strategies to deal with this criminogenic scourge. And looking at our society through the doorway of crime, I see necessity and anger woven in the fabric of our doings and undoings. The former, as we know, is the mother of invention, just as anger is the father. Considering the crisis that we now face, we, the movers and the shakers in this society, and on whatever level, and in whatever the sphere, have to be creative and proactive in the posture that we assume in the containment of crime. And it is a posture that must be holistic, for it is only in so doing that we can bring about a salubrious revolution in thought, perception, and conduct of the members of the society. And when we speak of the crisis, the countermeasures must be creative and creatively draconian. It is to be noted that this alarming and disconcerting incidence and phenomenon of crime is not peculiar to St. Lucia. It's a virtual feature of our vaunted Caribbean civilization. Jamaica, Trinidad and Tobago, St. Kitts, Nevis, and others are caught up in this criminogenic pandemic. A few years back, if I can correctly recall, Washington issued a crime emergency advisory in its region, in spite of the abundance of its human, financial, psychological, and technological resources. Very recently, the same obtained in New York. However, looking inward, there is still a certain geographic specificity. From this, one can see the patent need to transcend parochial, partisan, and political divides and come together as a nation to deal with the crisis of crime here in St. Lucia. And in this context, partisan politics is woefully dysfunctional, though, and paradoxically so, crime needs to be politicized as our imminent proclivities or propensities constrain our aspiring sublimation. To say that crime should not be politicized is inane, For the very provenance of crime is inextricably linked with 1. Human conduct that has been prescribed by the various arms or organs of government, and 2. The human condition that must be addressed by the body politic. Crime is an inevitable feature of every society, and like education and health, it must on some level and from some perspective be a policy matter for government. Indeed, and unfortunately, we are both sinner and saint. And that is indeed the fundamental ambiguity of the human condition. The seemingly inherent or acquired need to score political points seem to be the order of the day. And this precludes the appreciation and acceptance of objective, cogent, edifying, and meritorious views and suggestions which in the final analysis leave us wallowing in a mire of dysfunctional, mediocre commonality that is antithetical to the rigors of creative thought and action that are needed to adequately deal with the crisis of our time. And anomie, hopelessness, and even helplessness seem to prevail, and the country seemed directionless as far as the containment of crime is concerned. We all seem confused, even lost, as the shamans in the urban and rural communities rake in our hard-earned dollars as he or she prophesies on matters that cannot be prophesied. And so our son is shot, our daughter stabbed. And yet it has not dawned upon us that the pathos that surrounds us, and in terms of its genesis, is of the making of the very adult society. We are all complicit. I am complicit. A paradigm shift has to be made so that the recommendations emanating from this exercise can be embarked upon within the context of a holistic approach to the containment of crime. And this all-encompassing approach must be predicated upon 2 fundamental approaches that must be linked and must supplement each other. They are 1, the climate of crime, and 2, the climate for crime. A disjunction on the level of theory and practice will not cut the mustard. As we have all noticed and experienced, the incidence of crime is alarming. And hence this exercise, today's presentation, and what has accentuated or exacerbated this alarming situation is the nefarious involvement of our youth in this scenario of vicious, mindless, and sometimes deadly activity. And so the question that arises is what we as a society can do to paralytically address this wanton destruction of life, limb, and property. What can we the people do to contain the scourge? And by people, I mean the body politic, civil society, the churches, the schools, the homes. What is it that we the people can do to realistically face on an individual and collective basis the mirror on the wall of our lives? We have been here all this time, doing or undoing what? In terms of the etiology of crime, we have heard mentioned these factors: unemployment, dysfunctional homes, ubiquitous and continuous texting, genetic endowments, TV influence, absence of discipline in schools and the homes, sibling rivalry, characterological disposition, poverty, and even the internet. From this, one can conclude that crime, and in particular youthful crime, is a multifaceted phenomenon as far as its provenance is concerned. No one factor can be taken out of this miasma of causation as being the main cause of crime in our society. And since these elements of causation are linked in varying degrees, then the conclusion that can be arrived at is that the genesis of crime reposes in our individual and collective sins of commission and omission. We are all responsible, from the sinner to the priest, and from the beggar to the prince. In the context of youth crime, there has been a perverse metamorphosis from the mid-70s among those generations of youth to now, and which has metastasized throughout the societal corpus. One event during that block of time that was significantly instrumental in bringing about this perverse, noisome metamorphosis was the 25-year-old shift system in a distressing number of our primary schools. And that system, if I can correctly recall, was terminated in 2021. It was a period of time when the school children in their formative years were left unsupervised at a critical point in their lives and development. What did the shift students, who are now parents and grandparents, do during those unsupervised periods of time and endeavoring to cope with their pubertal libidinous propensities? This shift period, devoid of parental supervision and guidance, replicated itself day after day for 25 years. Can you imagine the damage in terms of character, attitude, morality, and deportment? Like rudderless ships, they crashed against the rocks and subterranean reefs of an increasing materialistic and individualistic world. Respect for self and others disappeared or was sacrificed on the altar of a rather secular hedonistic society. Can you imagine the mass psychological carnage with youthful needs and quasi-adult wants in a melange of uncontrolled exuberance? The incandescent passions of youth given venereal expression in a bacchanalian environment. And that situation of juvenile depravity and decadence was further compounded by the society transforming itself into a tourist economy, and where the exigencies of this economic activity necessitated the introduction of another commercially oriented shift system which still exists today. Isn't it then hypocritical to blame at this time our youth, since we created the world? And are you surprised that at this time we are indeed reaping the whirlwind? I think that it would be interesting and instructive if a socio-economic, generational, and demographic study were to be carried out to determine where those who formed and are forming the shift cohort are presently positioned in this society, and then compare them and their children with those who did not experience the shift or effect generationally. So much that was crucial, critical, and indispensable were denied the shift children in terms of their wholesome development. A virtual storm was created in their lives and that of their children. And now we are embracing that storm with trepidation. And so to you, the seemingly untouched, unblemished, pristine, and even righteous ones, you, the adults before me, I pose 3 questions. 1. How can you undo what has not been done? 2. How can you reform what has not been formed? 3. How can you rehabilitate he or she who has not been habilitated? As stated earlier, I have discerned a perverse metamorphosis among the youth of this country. At this time and in this era, they, the youth, have a cognitive discernment of what is wrong and what is right, what is good and what is evil, and what is vicious, virulent, and what is benign. But they do not have a moral sensitivity to that which is criminal and that which is not. There is a certain characterological dissonance between their moral sensibilities and their knowledge of good and evil. They have the intelligence, but not the morality. And as I have said in times past, intelligence and morals are ethical, and an ethical being can make choices, but among the choices are the things he or she will not do. And so when a boy of 19 shoots another within the comfort of his home, or a girl of 16 stabs her friend, that is not a matter of immorality. When a secondary school girl shoplifts along the Mikut Street promenade, that is not a matter of immorality. When a young man shoots his partner in the drug trade, that is not a matter of immorality. When a schoolgirl joins the prostitution ring in the CDC, that is not a matter of immorality. When a young man shoots from the window of a moving car at a crowded rum shop, and in consequence thereof, a patron is coerced into surrendering rather untimely his mortality, that is not a matter of immorality. And when a 17-year-old student sits in the front of her class with her thighs apart and smilingly gives her male teacher an unobstructed view of her titillating, fascinating possibilities, that is not immorality. At this time, in this era, in this age, these are not incidents of immorality. For immorality implies a certain grounding in moral values, moral dogmas, moral teaching that have become warped or tainted because of the negative vicissitudes of life, because of the struggles and conflict between good and evil in a domestic, personal, and thespian environment, the stage of life. Immorality is the breakdown of one's moral edifice, one's superego, as they combat with the values in action of the society. It connotes struggle, passive or otherwise, with a residual consciousness of that which is good, positive, wholesome, and normative in one's social environment. But then what we are faced with at this time and in this place, and since the shift system days, is not immorality, but amorality. Amorality among the children, the youth, and even the elderly of this nation. 25 years plus is a long time. And so a patent lack of conscience, be it social, spiritual, or otherwise, now defines the shift and quasi-shift cohorts, and the ensuing generations. At this time, there is no latent, passive, or actual abhorrence by the previous and this generation to the commission of any offense, be it murder, rape, robbery, assault, and so forth. These terms form part of the lexicon of the 12-year-old now sitting on a school bench or chair of a primary school. They commit and nothing registers. And so good and bad, pristine and vile, wicked and evil obtain their dubious legitimacy in a context of criminal acquisition and murderous disposition. A conscious and subconscious hedonistic impulse provides the justification and even the raison d'etre for the course of criminal activity embarked upon. And so when a 19-year-old boy snatches from the neck of an unsuspecting female octogenarian her gold chain of 100 years, and then speeds off into the bowels of the ghetto, all that matters to him is acquisition and the joy of acquisition. Her pain, her fright, her anger, her loss, her frustration and disappointment do not matter to him on any level. By the morrow, the incident would have been forgotten by him, and life continues rather placidly in the ghetto as the proceeds of the sale are used to purchase drugs, or grotesquely so, purchasing sustenance for his 3-year-old already crawling into the arena of crime and violence. And so the murders, the rapes, the robberies, with the shootings continue. And the youth moves on, oblivious or indifferent to the personal, human, social, and domestic dislocation and trauma that he has authored. And in a macabre and paradoxical fashion, he feels empowered among the denizens of his block. There is no conscience, and a putrid, alarming contagion spreads. What can we do, individually and collectively? And so the previous question comes to the fore. How can we rehabilitate he or she who has not been habilitated? That is contextually speaking. What can the government do? What can the nation do? What can you do? The amoral elements need to be contained, and the regression of self, of budding personalities and character must be stopped. As I see it, the shift and shifting generations are watching, and they are in some measure lost. They are increasing, perhaps not exponentially, but they are. And so what needs to be done very urgently, and for the survival of the society, is a focusing of therapeutic remedial attention on the homes and schools of the nation. The saving process of the child of 5 must begin immediately. Structures must need to be put in place to ventilate the dysfunctionalities that exist in the many homes and schools of the society. School curricula must be changed and expanded to embrace elements of conflict resolution, etiquette, critical thinking, team building, crucial conversations, leadership skills, ego building, spiritual orientation, and of course, patriotism. Also, neighborhoods need to be socially sanitized. There has to be a curricular change that will produce better educated, well-adjusted, and balanced young girls and boys. From the homes and schools, a youth population must emerge that is in dynamic equilibrium with the salubrious norms of the society. And so intrusive or invasive measures will have to be taken so that the domestic environment is in conformity with the rules, regulations, and laws of the nation in its diverse institutional format. The discharge of parental responsibilities must become a direct concern of government, and parents must position themselves in a way that is conducive to the proper development of the children. But then a certain problem arises when the parents are themselves children. Children are raised in the homes, and that imports the element of morality in great measure. For it is in this crucible of juvenile activity that the nascent nexus to that which is spiritual in its genesis is given at least civil expression and not a certain moral obliquity. Children are educated in the schools, and that imparts the element of intelligence. And as I've previously stated, intelligence and morals are ethical, and an ethical being can make choices, but among the choices are the things they will not do. The unbridled freedom and laissez-faire attitude that children are exposed to need to be curtailed. Children need to be disciplined, and sanctions need to be applied to parents who are delinquent in the discharge of their parental duties. Children must not be abused by their parents or by adults. Incidentally, I am a proponent of corporal punishment, but that is for another show. Adult abuse can take many forms. It can be insidious, psychological, and brutish. When, for example, an adult uses obscene language to a child, that, in my opinion, constitutes abuse, and the adult in question should be charged for the offense of abuse of a child. As I see it, we are in a state of crisis, and enlightened draconian measures must be adopted. The societal equilibrium must be established and maintained. There is need for societal introspection, and we of that society must again look at the mirror. Perhaps the time has come when a Ministry of Youth and Domestic Affairs needs to be created, and that has as its mandate to remit the wholesome development of our children and young persons. Its concerns should focus on where they live, how they live, what happens at school, what happens after school, what happens during the vacation periods, what happens when they cease being school attendees, and what time is spent in spiritual discourse. That is from 5 to 25 years of age. All of that must be focused upon, for parenting is too serious a responsibility to be left only or solely to parents. Parenting must become a government responsibility. And what pellucidly must be understood is that we as a society, and in our individual and maturational posture, must look not only at the climate of crime, but we must look at the climate for crime. And so what comes to mind at this juncture was the partial relocation of the Conway community a few years ago. What essentially was done in that noisome social environment was the clearing of tracts of bush and huts and virtually reconstructing hovels amidst the tree trunks and decaying vegetation. The modern civilized amenities were virtually non-existent. the quality of life of the transferees were not positively and meaningfully impacted upon. And what one eventually saw was a replication of a degrading and debasing settlement that once scarred the waterfront of Truganier. And so in that emerging community, I saw a morbid convergence of the climate of crime with the climate for crime. A grotesque social experiment for and of human habitation. What should have been done besides putting in the requisite physical infrastructure, and certainly not on a Neanderthal level, was the provision of the basic amenities of civilized living, with the introduction of police and social services to that budding community. Aspects of community policing should have been abundantly evident in all of its prophylactic aspects, and community solidarity with social workers should weave themselves into the fabric of this sub-community, so that family cohesion, edification, and parental care and concern will characterize the modus vivendi of this transferred settlement. And emerging therefrom would have been a functional intimacy between the professional public and the domestic sectors of the whole community in the context of law and order. But that did not happen. That did not take place. And so today, the adults and youth of Gorilla Village and other settlements, we are confronted in a pugilistic mode with what constitutes the bane of our societal existence. We have not evolved, for there is an acute debilitating disjunction between that sub-community and the rest. A somewhat dystopian social landscape. Salubrious integration, enlightened solidarity, and a humanistic social cohesion should characterize our rural-urban domestic spaces. But to the contrary, what I see and experience is a world of alarming lawlessness and disorder. We are at this time mired in a plethora of criminal events, and as a society we stand still, impotent, frustrated, and frightened. Who is to be blamed? We are all complicit in this situation, which at this time can be described as the breakdown of law and order. Human life seems to have no value. You only have to make $300 on the block available. And even of lesser value is that which, venereally speaking, defines human femininity. Crime defines and describes many a community, and perhaps to your bewilderment, it further describes your island home as a whole. We must save the generation that is now in attendance in the preschools and primary schools of the nation. A new relationship and responsibility need to be established and evolved between and among the homes, the schools, the churches, civil society, and government, but with accountability reposing in government as the guardian of the nation. And it is only in so doing that we can save the 5-year-old now sitting on the school benches or chairs of our country. For the greater part and beyond, the 14-year-olds are almost lost. They need to be contained, and creative strategies need to be devised to deal with amoral crime. And those who fall into that category, their last hope is bodily. If we fail in all of this, as we are presently failing, we shall witness an endless and relentless stream of young persons marching resolutely into the arena of crime and violence as the millennium passes us by, and with it, the hope and survival of our society. Regrettably, one arm or organ of our society has already failed us. Good people, the churches have failed us. We have to stop that stream and contemporaneous therewith deal with amoral crime among young persons in the homes, the schools, the ghettos, and the byways of this nation. But all of this implies a certain intrusion on the part of churches, the schools, civil society, and other public and private institutions that deal with youth writ large. That is from 5 to 25 years of age. And at last and specifically, all of this implies community policing in its essence and not in its adulterated, expedient, and half-baked form as presently evidenced. What needs to be understood is that community policing is not a public relations exercise. It is a working situation where the police work in cooperation with the community and not for it. The community shares the responsibility of dealing with crime and the maintenance of law and order. Hence, joint police community committees need to be established as formal mechanisms to deal with those relevant problems in each community. And all levels of the police should be vigorously involved in this conversation. But the police would provide the leadership in facilitating the effective cooperative efforts and thus enhancing crime prevention and the maintenance of law and order. As has been stated, the basis for successful community policing is the establishment of mechanisms for dialogue, information exchange, and consultation between the police and the citizenry. And in conjunction therewith are the formal mechanisms that provide a network of contacts within the community and permits ongoing communication between the parties. The police on their own will never be able to solve all of the problems of crime in any one community. The etiology of crime in its multifarious manifestations precludes that. The police will arrest, charge, and prosecute when they can, but they will not win the fight against crime. The perennial human condition precludes that also. The society, in its innate intrinsic complexity, can only aspire to reach the stars, but not the heavens. The bottom line is this: the maintenance of law and order is the responsibility of all of us, since we are all responsible for its provenance. And as I pontificated in times past, crime is everywhere, but the police is not everywhere. So how can that which is not everywhere contain that which is everywhere? When I look at the future, the children, the adolescents, the young ones, I ask myself, are they the key? What is their role in our dubious evolution? Is it to unlock that which is ahead of us, or to lock down the past into the present? Will they be society's liberators, to unfold the sublime and elevating potential of our world? Or will they be the anchor that will drag us down, including themselves, into the Stygian darkness and depths of criminality and violence? Time is of the essence. And the children must be saved even from themselves, for they are the hope of mankind. Where are they now? And so in relation to the youth of Fuasho, Monkey Town, Cap Estate, Bakafai, the Bacadere, and elsewhere, the refrain should be, and that should blanket our communities, is this: parents, do you know where your children are? But does that suffice? For the contagion is all pervasive, all ubiquitous. Are they at the SAB, at Pigeon Point, at the gardens, etc., etc.? They are here, there, and everywhere, but at home. But even then, that is a delusion, a pathetic hope. For if I had asked that gentle father at Balata for the whereabouts of his son that tragic evening, his heart-rending reply would be this: he is at home, murdered. That, ladies and gentlemen, is the crisis of our times. They are there all around us. Some have already committed themselves, while others are there, criminals in waiting with guns in hand. And the question that now comes to mind is this: where and how a 17-year-old youth finds or accesses a gun, even an AK-40 rifle? Guns are not manufactured in this country, and therefore all firearms of whatever the type have been imported. They are extraterritorial. And in this matter of importation, there are just two categories: lawful and illicit. In relation to the former, it should be unlawful for anyone to be in possession of a gun in St. Lucia, unless it is through a designated police agency. In other words, a security establishment or gun training school should only be able to access firearms through the requisite police agency. There should be no other avenue. As regards the placement of guns, that should be in an armory, a place where guns are stored. And all armories, wheresoever situate, and whether big or small, should be periodically audited by designated, the key word is designated, police officers. And those audits should be carried out without notice at least 3 times a year. In this way, the inventory of guns on island would be monitored. The police armory is not exempted. With regard to illicit firearms, vigilance and intelligence should be the operative terms. The police have got to be vigilant, and their intelligence capability should and could be enhanced and augmented. Community policing is pivotal. Another component in the strategy of dealing with the unlawful possession of firearms is deterrence. The public must be deterred, and that can only be achieved through the instrumentality of creative, draconian measures. For guns kill. The offense of unlawful possession should not be bailable. No bail. Once arrested, the offender must be detained until his or her day in court. And on conviction, a term of imprisonment should be mandatory. And in this regard, there should be 2 periods of time and 1 type of time. 5 years and 10 years in one instance, and hard time in the other. And by hard time, I mean, if you're sentenced for 5 years in December 2021, then your date of release is December 2026. There should be no intervention, be it for good behavior, governmental or judicial intervention, to reduce the 5 or 10-year period of incarceration. 10 years will be 10 years. 5 years will be 5 years. And to put all this in its proper perspective, there are two things to be considered. One, the country is in a state of crisis. And two, guns kill. There have been and will be gunfights in the very heart of our communities. And the police must be in the vanguard of these ballistic encounters. And to date, the police, have failed miserably. As I've already stated, crime is a multifarious phenomenon that impacts negatively, debilitatively on the quality of life of all societies. And in consequence thereof, all agencies, official, unofficial, secular, and spiritual, should be engaged on their level in the fight against the scourge in all of its manifestations. In reiteration and in conclusion, I repeat, we are mired in a reptilian state of crisis, and our youth in particular, their dreams, their aspirations, their potentialities and possibilities are all caught up in the malevolent and deadly coils of the python. That, ladies and gentlemen, ends my presentation on crime, a certain perception. I sincerely hope that among the grains of my thoughts, you will have discerned a pearl of wisdom and of truth. Thank you.